In lesson 3-8, we're going to answer the question, how do I compare, add, and subtract fractions and decimals with unlike denominators? This is the same essential question as lesson 3-7, but you will see there's a couple differences. What we are encountering in this lesson is, again, having to find common denominators, but it might not be as easy. In the last lesson, you saw that you only had to really change one fraction so that it had, the same denominator as the other fraction that was already there. And you could just see that, one was a common factor of the other, so it was pretty easy. This time, take a look at 2/3 and 5/4. This is on workbook page 107. Here, 3 is not a factor of 4. And 4 is not a factor of 3. So we can't set it up so that, 3 is the common denominator or 4 is the common denominator. We're going to have to come up with a completely new denominator for both fractions. Now, Virginia's strategy is to find a common denominator just by multiplying the denominators. 3 times 4 is 12. So if you multiply 3 times 4 to get 12, obviously, 3 is a factor of 12 and 4 is a factor of 12. So that could work out. Take your 2/3, turn that into a certain number of twelfths. 3 times 4 gives you 12. Do the same thing to the numerator. Now you have 8 twelfths. Oh, and the 5/4, same thing. This time, 4 times 3 is what gives you 12. 5 times 3 is what's going to give you 15 twelfths. So we had to find a common denominator, in this case 12, and we had to change both fractions so that they were equivalent fractions to what they originally were, but now have the common denominator of 12. And now we can add them up. 8 twelfths plus 15 twelfths gives you, well, you can see that right here, 23 twelfths, which, when you turn it into a mixed number, will give you 1 and 11 twelfths. So that's one strategy for finding a common denominator. Just multiply the denominators that you have. Now, case 2, we have 3/4 plus 5/6. Now, Roger's solution is to think of a number that is a multiple of both denominators. So, right now we have denominators of 4 and 6. Let's list out all the multiples of 4 and 6. So like if I were to count by 4s, that's 4, 8, 12, 16, so on and so forth. For 6, it would be 6, 12, 18, 24. And now what you can do is look for the least common multiple, the LCM. In this case, the least common multiple is 12. So you could use 12 as the common denominator, which is what Roger did here. He took the 3/4 and he turned that into 9 twelfths. And he took the 5/6 and he turned that one into 10 twelfths. So now we have 9 twelfths plus 10 twelfths, which gives you 19 twelfths. And then you can turn that into 1 and 7 twelfths when you turn it back into a mixed number. So that's one strategy that you could also use. You could just list out all the multiples of both denominators until you find the least common multiple. That's also called the least common denominator too, the LCD. And Serena says, well, if I can't think of a common multiple, I'll just use Virginia's method and multiply the numerator and denominator of each fraction by the other factor. So basically, just multiply the denominators, which is what they're talking about here. 4 times 6 gives you 24, and you can use 24 as your common denominator if you choose. So let's do some practice. This is workbook page 107. Here we have 4/5 plus 2/3. So one strategy here might be to, maybe just multiply the denominators. So maybe I want to multiply 5 and 3. That would give me 15. So maybe I'll use 15 as my common denominator. So I'm going to rewrite it And let's see, 3 times 5 is what gives me 15. 2 times 5 gives me 10. 5 times 3 gives me 15, and 4 times 3 gives me 12. So I can turn the 4/5 into 12/15, and I can turn the 2/3 into 10/15, and I can add it up that way. Now, remember, we keep the denominators the same, and now I have 22/15, which gives me 1 and 7/15. So in this case, I just used the strategy of multiplying the denominators to get my common denominator. Now for number 4, I could do the same thing. I could multiply 9 times 6 and use 54 as my common denominator. Or maybe I want to list out all the multiples of 9 and 6. Let's see, for 9 I have 9, 18, 27, 36. For 6 I have, well, 6, 12, 18, 24. It looks like 18 could be used as my common denominator. In this case, it's actually the least common denominator. So I'm thinking I'd rather use the least common denominator rather than 54. Now if you use 54, that's not wrong. It just might mean that you'll have to do some more simplifying at the end. So let's see, I've got, maybe I'll try both. 5/9. Let's see what that would look like out of 18. That would be 10/18. And the 1/6, if I turn that into an equivalent fraction with 18 as the denominator, I have 3/18. 10/18 minus 3/18 is going to give me 7/18. That's if I choose to use 18 as my common denominator. Watch what happens if I decide to go with 54 instead. So I'm going to keep the 5/9 and the 1/6, obviously. And let's see, I'm going to change the color. Let's go with blue. What if I decide to use 54? So 54 could also be a common denominator. 9 times 6 gives me 54, 5 times 6 gives me 30. 6 times 9 gives me 54, 1 times 9 gives me 9. So now I have 30 54ths minus 9 54ths, and that's going to give me 21 54ths. But I cannot leave that as my answer. Did you know that that's not in simplest form? You actually have to simplify it. Do you know what you could divide 21 and 54 by? In this case, you can divide it by 3. And that will give you the 7/18 that I had here. Do you see the difference? If you find the least common denominator, then you might not have to do a lot of simplifying at the end. If you don't find the least common denominator, you will have to simplify. Be careful, it might not be obvious what you can divide by. Take your time when it's time to simplify. So here are the takeaways. When you need to find a common denominator, option 1, you can multiply the denominators. You're guaranteed to get a common denominator just by multiplying the ones that you have. Or, if you don't want to worry about simplifying later on, list out the multiples of the denominators to find the least common multiple, also known as the least common denominator.